She had learned, somewhere between raising children and burying a husband, that silence on the phone often said more than words ever could. Evelyn Hart was 79 years old, and every Sunday at 3 p.m. her phone would ring. It had been ringing at that exact time for nearly 6 years now, ever since her daughter Jessica moved to Seattle for work, taking Evelyn's only grandson with her. The calls were as reliable as the tides, as predictable as the seasons, and lately just as hollow. Evelyn lived in a small brick bungalow in a quiet neighborhood outside Cincinnati, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where people still mowed their own lawns and waved from porches and knew each other's names, even if they didn't know each other's stories. Her house had 3 bedrooms, far too much space for one elderly woman, but she'd lived there for 42 years, raised Jessica there, nursed her husband through his final illness there. The walls held too much history to leave behind now. This particular Sunday in early November, Evelyn sat in her living room armchair, the blue one by the window that caught the afternoon light, with her tea cooling on the side table and her phone face up on her lap. 2:58. The clock on the mantel ticked its steady rhythm. Outside, her neighbor was raking leaves into careful piles that the wind would scatter by evening. 3 o'clock came. The phone rang. Evelyn let it ring twice before answering. Not a power play, just the time it took to set down her teacup and pick up the phone properly. "Hello, sweetheart." "Hi, Mom." Jessica's voice carried that particular tone of someone completing a task, warm enough to pass inspection, but not warm enough to linger. "How are you?" "I'm well. How are you? How's Brandon?" "We're good. Busy. Brandon's got a big project due for school, so he's been stressed. I've been working late most nights. There's this client who keeps changing their mind about everything." Jessica sighed. "But we're managing." "That sounds difficult." "It is what it is." A pause. Evelyn could hear something in the background, television maybe, or music. "How was your week?" Evelyn thought about her week. Monday, she'd volunteered at the library like she did every Monday, helping elderly patrons navigate the computers. Tuesday, she'd had lunch with her friend Marion, whose arthritis was getting worse. Wednesday, she'd gone to her book club, where they'd discussed a novel about aging that had made everyone cry. Thursday, she spent the afternoon organizing her late husband's photographs, something she'd been putting off for 3 years. Friday, she baked bread and taken a loaf to her neighbor whose wife had had surgery. Saturday, she did her grocery shopping and her laundry and watched a documentary about birds. A full week, a quiet week, a week that would sound desperately lonely if she tried to describe it to her daughter. "Uneventful, the usual routines," Evelyn said. "That's good. Routines are good." Jessica's voice drifted slightly, as if her attention had moved elsewhere. "Listen, Mom, I have to keep this short today. Brandon and I are heading out soon, his friend having a birthday thing." "Of course. Give Brandon my love." "I will. Love you. Talk next week." "Love you too, sweetheart." The call lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Evelyn knew this because she'd started tracking the duration 6 months ago, writing the times in a small notebook she kept in her desk drawer. Not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she needed to know if she was imagining the pattern or if it was real. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Last week had been 5 minutes and 12 seconds. The week before, 3 minutes and 51 seconds. The longest call in the past 3 months had been 8 minutes and 19 seconds, and that was only because Jessica needed advice about a problem with her landlord. Evelyn set the phone back on the side table and picked up her tea. Still lukewarm, she drank it anyway. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering her neighbor's careful piles of leaves across the lawn. He'd have to rake them again. Some things required endless repetition, no matter how futile they seemed. Evelyn had been a mother for 41 years. Jessica had been born when Evelyn was 38, a surprise pregnancy coming after years of trying and eventual acceptance that children might not happen for her and Thomas. Then Jessica arrived, small and furious and utterly transforming. Those early years had been exhausting and wonderful. Thomas had been a present father, involved in the night feedings and diaper changes in a way many men of his generation weren't. They'd been a team, a small, tired, deeply connected team. Jessica had been an easy child, curious, thoughtful, independent. She did well in school, made friends easily, caused no real trouble. She went to college in Ohio, majored in marketing, landed a good job right after graduation. She dated, though never seriously, focused on her career instead. Then, at 33, Jessica announced she was pregnant. No partner, a donor situation, she explained. She wanted to be a mother, didn't want to wait for a relationship that might never come. Evelyn was surprised but supportive. Thomas had been thrilled. Brandon was born 6 months before Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Evelyn remembered those overlapping timelines with painful clarity. The joy of a grandchild and the terror of terminal illness existing simultaneously, pulling her in opposite directions. She'd tried to be present for both, helping Jessica with the baby while nursing Thomas through his decline. Jessica had lived nearby then, just 20 minutes away, close enough for daily visits, close enough for Evelyn to be truly helpful. Thomas died when Brandon was 14 months old, too young to remember his grandfather, too young to understand why Grandma cried so much. The grief had been enormous, the kind that reshapes you. Evelyn had gotten through it the way most people do, one day at a time, finding small reasons to get out of bed, accepting that the pain would never fully disappear but might eventually become bearable. Jessica had been there during that time, calling daily, visiting weekly, bringing Brandon over to distract Evelyn with his toddler chaos. It had helped, not healed, but helped. Then, 3 years after Thomas died, Jessica got the job offer in Seattle. Better pay, better opportunities, a chance to build the life she wanted. She'd asked Evelyn's opinion, clearly hoping for a blessing rather than an objection. Evelyn had given the blessing. What else could she do? Jessica was an adult. Brandon was her child. They needed to live their own lives. Evelyn couldn't ask them to stay just because she was lonely. But she'd hoped, quietly, secretly, that the distance would be temporary, that Jessica would realize she missed Ohio, that she'd move back eventually. 6 years later, that hope had faded to something smaller, something Evelyn tried not to examine too closely. The weekly calls had started immediately after the move, Jessica's idea, a way to stay connected despite the distance. Evelyn had been grateful. The calls were something to look forward to, a scheduled reminder that she still mattered to her daughter. But somewhere along the way, Evelyn couldn't pinpoint exactly when, the calls had changed. They'd gotten shorter, less substantial, more perfunctory. Jessica would call at 3 o'clock, they'd exchange pleasantries, and then Jessica would find a reason to end the conversation. Evelyn had tried various approaches, asking more questions about Jessica's life, sharing more details about her own, suggesting video calls so she could see Brandon, proposing visits, her flying to Seattle or them coming to Cincinnati. Jessica always had reasons. Work was busy, Brandon had school, flights were expensive, maybe next month, maybe over the holidays, maybe in the spring. The maybes accumulated like unpaid debts. Evelyn tried not to take it personally. Jessica was busy. Single parenthood and a demanding career left little room for anything else. The calls were proof that Jessica was trying, even if they felt inadequate. But Evelyn had lived long enough to recognize the difference between busy and avoidant, between overwhelmed and disengaged. Something had shifted in her daughter. Evelyn just didn't know what or why. The following Sunday arrived with its predictable rhythm. 3 o'clock, the phone rang. Evelyn answered. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" "Tired. It's been a week." Jessica's voice sounded strained. "Brandon's school called. He's been having some behavior issues. Nothing major, but they want to set up a meeting. And work has been insane. I'm basically running on caffeine and spite at this point." Evelyn felt her chest tighten with concern. "What kind of behavior issues?" "Just not paying attention in class, being disruptive. The teacher thinks he might need to be evaluated for ADHD, but I don't know. He's fine at home. Well, mostly fine. He's on his iPad a lot, but what kid isn't these days?" "That sounds stressful." "It is." A pause. "I don't really want to talk about it, honestly. I just needed to vent for a second." "Of course. I'm here if you need to talk more." "I know, thanks." Jessica's tone shifted back to perfunctory. "How was your week?" And there it was again, the redirect, the closing of the door that had briefly opened. Evelyn had seen this pattern before. Jessica would share something real, something vulnerable, and then immediately retreat behind small talk and quick goodbyes. "Quiet," Evelyn said. "I had lunch with Marion. We went to that cafe near the library." "That's nice." "She asked about you, about Brandon. I showed her the pictures you sent last month." "The ones from his soccer game?" "Yes. He looked so grown up in his uniform." "He's getting tall, growing like crazy. I can barely keep him in shoes." Jessica's voice had that distracted quality again. "Listen, Mom, I should probably go. I've got laundry to fold and a million other things." "Of course. Give Brandon a hug for me." "I will. Love you. Talk next week." The call lasted 6 minutes and 43 seconds. Evelyn sat with the phone in her lap for a long time after Jessica hung up. The afternoon light slanted through her window, illuminating dust motes that drifted in lazy spirals. Outside, a dog barked. A car drove past. The ordinary sounds of Sunday afternoon continued, indifferent to her small, private heartbreak. Jessica was struggling. Brandon was struggling. And Evelyn was 2,000 miles away, limited to 6-minute phone calls that barely scratched the surface of what her daughter needed. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how to help someone who wouldn't let her close enough to see what was really wrong. Evelyn had a friend named Marion who'd been widowed around the same time she had. They'd met at a grief support group and bonded over their shared experience of losing husbands to cancer. Marion was blunt and funny and refreshingly honest about the challenges of aging alone. They met for lunch every Tuesday at a small cafe that served excellent soup and didn't rush you out after you'd finished eating. This particular Tuesday, Evelyn arrived to find Marion already seated, working on a crossword puzzle with fierce concentration. 7-letter word for burden, ends in E, Marion said without looking up. "Baggage," Evelyn suggested, sliding into the seat across from her. "Perfect." Marion filled it in, then set the puzzle aside. "You look tired." "I'm fine." That's what people say when they're not fine. Marion's gaze was sharp behind her reading glasses. "What's wrong?" Evelyn considered deflecting, but Marion would see through it. She always did. "Jessica called on Sunday." And it was the same as always, short, surface level. She mentioned Brandon as having problems at school, but then wouldn't talk about it, just changed the subject and ended the call. Marion frowned. How long has this been going on? Months, maybe longer. It's hard to say exactly when it started. Evelyn twisted her napkin between her fingers. I know she's busy. I know single parenthood is difficult, but I can't shake the feeling that she's deliberately keeping me at a distance. Have you asked her directly? How do you ask your daughter if she's avoiding you without sounding accusatory or needy? By asking directly and accepting that it might sound accusatory or needy. Marian leaned back as the server arrived with their usual orders: tomato soup for Marian, chicken salad for Evelyn. Once the server left, Marian continued, The not knowing is probably worse than whatever the truth is. Evelyn considered this. Marian was right, as she usually was. The uncertainty was its own kind of torture, but asking the question felt risky. Once you opened that door, you couldn't unopen it. I'm afraid, Evelyn admitted quietly. Of what? Of finding out that I've become an obligation, that she calls because she feels she has to, not because she wants to. The words hurt to say out loud. Of learning that I'm not actually important to her anymore. Marian reached across the table and squeezed Evelyn's hand. You are important. You're her mother. That doesn't just stop mattering. Doesn't it? I've been thinking about my own mother lately, how I used to call her once a week when I was Jessica's age, how those calls felt like duty sometimes, how I didn't always understand what she needed from me. Evelyn's voice dropped. Maybe this is just how it goes. Children grow up, they move away, they build their own lives, and parents become peripheral. Maybe, Marian said, but maybe not. Maybe Jessica's struggling with something and doesn't know how to ask for help. Maybe she's protecting you from something. Maybe it's not about you at all. Then what do I do? You be patient. You keep showing up, and when the right moment comes, you ask the hard questions. Marian returned to her soup, but you have to be ready to hear answers you might not like. Evelyn thought about that conversation for days. She thought about it while she volunteered at the library, helping an elderly man figure out how to send an email to his granddaughter. She thought about it while she organized her closet, pulling out Thomas's old sweaters that she'd kept for years and finally admitting she'd never wear them. She thought about it during her book club, where they discussed a novel about mothers and daughters and all the complicated love between them. She thought about her own mother, who died 15 years ago, about their relationship, which had been affectionate but not especially close, about how Evelyn had called dutifully every week but often felt relieved when the calls were short, about how she'd visited on holidays but always felt a vague guilt about not visiting more often. After her mother died, she'd wished she'd asked more questions, listened more carefully, tried harder to understand the woman behind the title of mom. Was Jessica feeling that same dutiful distance toward her? Was history repeating itself, with Evelyn now playing the role of the mother who didn't quite understand her daughter's life? The Sunday call came, 4 minutes and 59 seconds. Jessica sounded distracted. Brandon was fine, work was busy, weather was rainy, nothing real, nothing deep, a ritual emptied of meaning. Evelyn hung up and sat in her chair by the window, watching the November light fade to gray. She thought about what Marian had said, about asking the hard questions, about being ready for answers she might not like. She wasn't sure she was ready, but Marian was right about one thing. The not knowing was worse than any truth could be. Evelyn had always been good at observation. It was one of her defining traits, the ability to notice small details, to read between lines, to see patterns others missed. Thomas used to joke that she had a sixth sense for when something was wrong. She turned that observation on herself now, examining her own behavior with Jessica over the past 6 years, looking for the moment when things had shifted, trying to understand her own role in this growing distance. She remembered the first year after Jessica moved to Seattle, she'd called Jessica often, maybe too often, multiple times per week, sometimes daily. She'd been lonely, still grieving Thomas, desperate for connection. Jessica had been patient at first, but eventually she gently suggested they establish a regular schedule, 1 call per week. That way, both of them would know when to expect it. Evelyn agreed, though she'd been hurt. She'd tried to hide the hurt, but Jessica probably sensed it anyway. The second year, Evelyn had visited twice. Both visits had been tense, not overtly, no fights or arguments, but there'd been an undercurrent of strain. Jessica trying to manage her work schedule and Brandon's needs while also entertaining Evelyn. Evelyn trying not to be too much, not to impose, not to criticize any of Jessica's parenting choices, even when she disagreed. The third year, Evelyn had offered to move to Seattle, to be closer, to help with Brandon, to be more present in their lives. Jessica had said no, kindly but firmly. She appreciated the offer, but she needed her independence. She was building her own life. She needed space to figure things out. Evelyn understood, or tried to, but the rejection had stung. The fourth and fifth years blurred together, fewer visits, shorter calls, more distance, Jessica pulling away gradually like a tide receding, and Evelyn, uncertain how to bridge that distance without pushing too hard, had pulled back too, trying to give Jessica the space she'd asked for, trying not to be needy. But maybe in trying not to be too much, she'd become too little. Maybe Jessica had interpreted Evelyn's restraint as disinterest. Maybe they'd gotten trapped in a cycle of mutual withdrawal, each thinking they were respecting the other's boundaries while actually just creating more distance. Or maybe Evelyn was overanalyzing. Maybe Jessica was simply busy and tired and doing her best. Maybe the weekly calls, however brief, were proof of love rather than obligation. But Evelyn's instincts said otherwise, and after 79 years, she'd learned to trust her instincts. The call came the following Sunday. Evelyn answered on the second ring, as always. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetheart." Evelyn took a breath. "How are you, really?" There was a pause, brief but noticeable. "I'm okay. Why?" "You've sounded stressed lately. I wanted to check in." "I'm fine, just busy. You know how it is." Jessica's tone had shifted, slightly defensive, slightly guarded. Evelyn felt the familiar urge to back off, to accept the deflection, to keep the peace. But she thought about Marion's words, about asking hard questions, about being brave enough to risk discomfort for the sake of truth. "Jessica, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are these calls, our Sunday calls, are they something you want to do, or are they something you feel obligated to do?" The silence that followed was long enough that Evelyn wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Jessica's voice came back, quieter now. "Why are you asking that?" "Because I need to know, because I don't want to be a burden, because I love you and I want our relationship to be real, not just dutiful." Evelyn's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "Jessica, if these calls feel like an obligation, we can change how we do this. We can call less often, or just text, or whatever works for you. I just need to know where we stand." Another long pause. Evelyn could hear Jessica breathing on the other end of the line. "I don't know what to say," Jessica said finally. "The truth would be good." "The truth is—" Jessica stopped, started again. "The truth is complicated." "I can handle complicated." Jessica laughed, but it sounded more like a release of tension than humor. Can you? Because I've been trying to protect you from complicated. Protect me from what? From everything. From my stress, from my struggles, from the fact that I'm barely holding it together most days. Jessica's voice cracked slightly. You lost Dad 3 years before I moved. You were finally starting to seem okay. I didn't want to burden you with my problems. I thought keeping things light and brief was better than dumping all my stress on you every week. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. So you weren't avoiding me, you were trying to protect me. Yes, I guess, I don't know, Jessica sighed. But also, maybe I was avoiding you a little, because talking to you reminds me of Dad, and of Ohio, and of a time when my life felt simpler, and sometimes that makes me sad, and I don't have energy to be sad on top of everything else. Oh, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I know that's not fair to you. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just, Jessica's voice was thick now, like she was crying. It's just hard, all of it. Being a single parent and working full time and trying to help Brandon with his problems and never having enough time or money or patience. And calling you every week reminds me that I'm doing this alone, that Dad's not here, that I moved away from everyone who could help me. And that's my own fault, but it still hurts. Evelyn's eyes were wet too. It's not your fault, Jessica. You made choices that made sense for your career and your life. There's nothing wrong with that. Then why do I feel guilty about it? Because you're human, because you love me and you miss your father and you're overwhelmed. All of that can be true at the same time. Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But sweetheart, you don't have to protect me. I'm stronger than you think, and I'd rather know what's really happening in your life, even if it's hard, than have these surface-level conversations that leave both of us feeling empty. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't realize they left you feeling empty. They've been feeling that way for both of us, I think. Yeah, Jessica's voice was small. Yeah, they have. They sat in that shared recognition for a moment. The call had already longer than any conversation in months, and they hadn't even talked about anything specific yet. Just feelings, just truth. Can I tell you about what's been going on? Really tell you? Please. Jessica talked for 47 minutes about her job, which she actually hated but couldn't afford to leave, about Brandon's school issues, which were more serious than she initially let on, possible ADHD, yes, but also anxiety and what might be depression, about her loneliness, living in a city where she'd never quite built a strong community, about her fears that she was failing as a mother, about her grief for Thomas that still hit her unexpectedly, about her guilt for moving away from Evelyn, about her exhaustion, bone deep and constant. Evelyn listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, just listened, and occasionally she said things like, "That sounds really hard," or "I understand," or "You're doing better than you think." When Jessica finally ran out of words, Evelyn asked, "What do you need from me?" "I don't know. What can you offer?" "I can listen like this, every week or more often if you want. Real conversations, not just check-ins." Evelyn paused. "I can come visit if you'd like help with Brandon, or you could come here, both of you. Maybe a change of scenery would help." "I don't want to burden you. You're not a burden. You're my daughter, and Brandon is my grandson. Helping you isn't a burden. It's a privilege." Evelyn's voice was firm. "But I need you to let me help. That means being honest about what's happening. That means allowing me to be present for the hard stuff, not just the surface stuff. What if it's too much? What if I dump all my problems on you and it's overwhelming? Then I'll tell you, I promise. I'm old, not fragile. I can handle your real life. Evelyn smiled, even though Jessica couldn't see it. I'd much rather handle your real life than pretend everything's fine when it's not. Jessica was crying again. Evelyn could hear it in her breathing. I'm sorry I've been shutting you out. I'm sorry I didn't push harder to stay connected. We both made mistakes. We can do better now. Yeah, we can. Jessica took a shaky breath. Thank you, Mom, for asking, for listening, for caring enough to have this conversation, even though it was uncomfortable. That's what mothers do, sweetheart, even when their children are adults, even across 2,000 miles. Evelyn's own throat was tight. I love you. That doesn't change. It never will. I love you too. The Sunday calls changed after that. They got longer, for one thing, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. Jessica talked about her real struggles, and Evelyn listened. Evelyn shared more about her own life, too, not just the sanitized version, but the real one, her loneliness, her grief, her fears about aging. They talked about Thomas more, sharing memories, laughing about his terrible jokes, and his stubborn insistence on fixing things himself, even when he had no idea what he was doing. Jessica cried sometimes during these conversations, but it was the good kind of crying, the kind that released pressure rather than building it. Evelyn flew to Seattle in December. She stayed for 2 weeks, helping with Brandon, giving Jessica time to breathe. She took Brandon to a park one afternoon and talked to him about school, about feelings, about how it was okay to struggle sometimes. He was quiet at first, but eventually he opened up, told her about the kids who made fun of him for being fidgety, about how hard it was to focus when his brain felt like it was going a million directions, about how he missed having a dad, even though he'd never known what having a dad felt like. Evelyn held him while he cried and told him he was brave and strong and that asking for help wasn't weakness. She told him about his grandfather, about how Thomas had struggled with depression for years but had learned to manage it, about how mental health was just health, nothing to be ashamed of, about getting evaluated for ADHD wasn't a sign of failure, but a step toward understanding himself better. Brandon seemed lighter after that conversation. Not fixed. Nothing was fixed, but lighter. Jessica noticed. I don't know what you said to him, but thank you. He's been calmer this past week. I just listened and told him it was okay to not be okay. You should have been doing that. You are doing that. You're getting him evaluated. You're advocating for him at school. You're being a good mother. Evelyn squeezed Jessica's hand. But you can't do it all alone. That's why I'm here. Evelyn returned to Cincinnati with a fuller heart than she'd had in years. The weekly calls continued, but they were different now, real and warm and occasionally difficult, but always honest. In January, Jessica called on a Wednesday, not their usual Sunday. Is this okay? I know it's not our normal time. It's perfect. What's going on? Nothing bad. I wanted to hear your voice. I had a hard day at work and Brandon was being difficult and I felt overwhelmed and I thought instead of waiting until Sunday, I could just call. Is that okay? It's more than okay. You can call anytime, Jessica. Any day, anytime. I'm learning that. It's taking time, but I'm learning. They talked for 20 minutes about Jessica's difficult day, about strategies for handling Brandon's behavior, about nothing and everything. When they hung up, Evelyn felt grateful, not just for the call, but for the trust it represented. Jessica was letting her in. Finally, truly letting her in. February brought Valentine's Day. A package arrived at Evelyn's door, a card from Brandon, handmade, covered in crayon hearts and the words, I love you, Grandma, in wobbly letters. Inside the envelope was a note from Jessica. He wanted to make this for you. He talks about you all the time now. Thank you for being there for him. For us. Love, Jay. Evelyn put the card on her mantel next to a photo of Thomas. Two loves separated by time and distance, but both deeply present in her life. March brought spring. Jessica called on a Sunday, their regular time, and said, "I've been thinking, maybe Brandon and I could come visit this summer. For a week, maybe 2, if that works for you." "It works perfectly." "Yeah?" Jessica sounded pleased. "Good, because I think Brandon needs to see where I grew up, where his grandfather lived. I think he needs to know that part of his history." "I'd love to show him. And honestly, I think I need it too. I need to remember where I came from. I need to—" Jessica paused. "I need to come home, even just for a little while." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. "You're always welcome home, sweetheart. Always." The summer visit happened in July. Brandon was fascinated by everything: the house where his mother grew up, the neighborhood where she'd played as a child, the photos of his grandfather that filled Evelyn's albums. He asked a million questions, and Evelyn answered every one with patience and love. Jessica seemed to relax more with each passing day. The tension she'd been carrying for years gradually released. She slept better, laughed more, talked about her life with less stress and more acceptance. One evening, after Brandon had gone to bed, Jessica and Evelyn sat on the back porch with glasses of lemonade, watching fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. "I'm sorry," Jessica said quietly. "For what?" "For pulling away, for making you feel like an obligation, for not trusting you with my real life." Jessica turned to look at Evelyn. "I thought I was protecting you, but I think I was really protecting myself." "From what?" "From admitting I needed help, from accepting that I couldn't do everything alone, from feeling vulnerable." Jessica smiled sadly. "I inherited Dad's stubbornness, I guess." "You did, but you also inherited his courage. It takes courage to ask for help, to admit you're struggling, to let someone see you when you're not at your best." Evelyn reached over and took Jessica's hand. "I'm proud of you. For everything you've accomplished, yes, but mostly for learning to let me back in." "It feels good. Scary sometimes, but good." "That's how the best things feel." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies, listening to the evening sounds of the neighborhood. Evelyn felt a peace she hadn't felt in years. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. Jessica still struggled. Brandon still had challenges ahead. Life was still hard and complicated and uncertain. But they were facing it together now, connected again, honest again, real again. And that was enough. The weekly calls continued, but they weren't just weekly anymore. Jessica called when she needed to, which was sometimes twice a week, sometimes 3 times. Sometimes the calls were short, just a check-in, a moment of connection. Sometimes they were long, deep conversations that lasted over an hour. Evelyn treasured all of them equally. She'd learned something important through this experience, something she wished she'd understood earlier but was grateful to understand now. Distance wasn't really about geography. You could live 2,000 miles apart and still be close, or you could live in the same house and be strangers. What mattered was honesty, vulnerability, the willingness to show up, not just physically but emotionally. The courage to say, "I'm struggling," and "I need you," and "I don't have it all figured out." She thought about her own mother, gone 15 years now, about all the conversations they'd never had, all the surface-level check-ins that hid deeper needs, all the opportunities for real connection that Evelyn had missed because she'd been too busy, too distracted, too unwilling to be vulnerable. She couldn't get those chances back, but she had this chance with Jessica, and she wasn't going to waste it. Marian asked her one Tuesday over lunch how things were going with Jessica. "Better, so much better," Evelyn said. "You asked the hard questions." "I did, and you were right. The truth was better than the uncertainty, even though the truth was complicated and painful and required both of us to be more vulnerable than we wanted to be." "That's usually how it works," Marian smiled. "I'm glad you found your way back to each other." "Me too." Evelyn was 79 years old. She'd lived through hardship and joy, raised a daughter, buried a husband, navigated grief and loneliness and the particular challenges of aging alone. She'd made mistakes. She'd had regrets. She'd done things she was proud of and things she wished she could redo. But this, rebuilding her relationship with Jessica, connecting with Brandon, learning to be honest about her needs while also being present for theirs, felt like one of the most important things she'd ever done. Not because it was dramatic or heroic, not because it would change the world or leave some grand legacy, but because it mattered to the people she loved most, because it transformed obligation into genuine connection, because it proved that it was never too late to start over, to do better, to choose vulnerability over self-protection. The Sunday calls continued, but now when the phone rang at 3 o'clock, Evelyn picked it up with genuine anticipation rather than quiet dread, because she knew that Jessica's voice would be real, that the conversation would matter, that they were building something together that would last. She'd learned, somewhere between raising a child and burying a husband and rebuilding a relationship that nearly slipped away, that silence on the phone often said more than words ever could. But she'd also learned that sometimes you had to break the silence. You had to ask the hard questions. You had to risk discomfort for the sake of truth. And when you did, when you were brave enough to be vulnerable, patient enough to listen, and wise enough to recognize that love sometimes required difficult conversations, you discovered that the silence could transform into something better. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And real was all that mattered.